Hello, welcome back. This is Professor Young, and this is our beginning look at the female reproductive system. This will be a two-part session. This first part will focus really on female anatomy, reproductive anatomy, as well as egg development. And the second part, part two, will focus specifically on the menstrual cycle. And so this is really, truly the beginning of the end. The light is at the end of the tunnel for you, and you are almost there. So let's go ahead and begin this journey through the female reproductive system. And as we've done in the past, let's start with basic anatomy. Female reproductive anatomy is fairly straightforward and simple. It's not as convoluted as it was within the male anatomy, with tubes going every which way and things like that. And so if we look, we see that we have some fairly straightforward, simple structures. We've got a paired structure, one being right there, one being right here. These are the ovaries. Of course, this is where the eggs will be produced. And we'll talk about egg production here in a little bit. From the ovaries, the eggs would be released, and when they are released, they will be sucked up into what we refer to as the oviducts. And you can see again, there is one oviduct, or fallopian tube, as they are sometimes referred to as, near each ovary. And basically what you are looking at here is at the beginning of the oviducts, there are fimbriae. Now, fimbriae is just a fancy word that means a little feather-like, finger-like projections that beat back and forth, and they create a current that will suck up the egg and pull it up into the oviduct. It's important to remember it is within the oviducts where we see fertilization that happens. And so that egg needs to be able to enter into that oviduct system if it ever has hopes of meeting up with potential sperm to be fertilized, creating that little old zygote and developing fetus eventually. And so if we continue our little journey from the oviducts, now that the egg has entered into the oviducts, it's going to travel down, and it's going to enter into this region right here, which is called the uterus. And as we will, the two most important are the myometrium and the endometrium, but there's also the perimetrium. And again, we'll look at this here in a couple of slides. But it's within where the egg will potentially attach and anchor itself in to begin fetal development. From the uterus, we can continue to travel downward, where we will encounter a couple more structures. Structure number one is actually located right at the base of the uterus, kind of connecting the uterus with the vagina, and that becomes the cervix. And so that cervical area I will outline in blue. So in blue there represents the region of the cervix. Excuse me. Passing through the cervix, we then enter into the vagina, which, as we will learn and discuss in a little bit, is a extremely acidic environment. And it needs to be, because it does have direct access to the access world. Lots of microbes, lots of bacteria, lots of potential for exposure. And so the low pH, anywhere between a 3 and a 5, The low pH enables it to kind of kill off anything that might be foreign within the body. It keeps the bacterial colonies, if you would, or the exposure to bacteria to a minimum. And again, we'll discuss how that all happens here in a little bit. And lastly, outlined here in the light blue, we've got the external genitalia, at least part of the external genitalia within female anatomy, and that would be the labia minor. And then if we were to continue this, directly outside of the labia minor, I'm outlining here in blue or drawing in blue, would be the labia major. And so that's kind of the key female reproductive structures that we have. Again, we start with the ovaries, which is where egg maturity and release is happening. From there, the eggs are pulled into the oviducts via these little feather-like structures known as the fimbriae. And as the egg travels down into the oviducts, they enter into the uterus, which is, of course, is where, if the egg has been fertilized, the developing or impending fetus will develop. Through the uterus, you enter into the cervix. Passing through the cervix, you enter into the vagina. And then coming out through the vagina, you encounter the external genitalia, which is the labia minor. And then surrounding the labia minor would be the labia major. Talking a little bit about the ovaries. Of course, naturally, the main focus of the ovaries is egg development. And we're going to talk more about that here in the second part of this session. But the other thing that goes along with egg development and egg maturity is the release of hormones and even the production of some hormones, specifically estradiol and progesterone. And so when we talk production and release, we are really looking at we're really looking at estradiol and progesterone as being the two hormones that are produced and released from within the ovaries. We do know now, at least through lecture, that luteinizing hormone LH and follicle stimulating hormone FSH also play a key role, but they're not ovary-based hormones. Remember, they are anterior pituitary-based hormones. And so don't lose sight of that. Don't lose sight of that. And then, of course, there's some information there just on really what they look like, which isn't too critical, but it at least gives you that mindset. And then again, you've got the diagram there on the previous slide that can help you with that. And so, again, remember, moving from the ovary right here, that egg is released and will come into the fallopian tube. Right. Here you can see in this nice little diagram here, the fimbriae. And these are those finger-like projections, feather-like projections that are going to create a current that is hopefully going to catch the egg and pull it into the oviduct itself. And those oviducts are going to go from the region of the ovary. They're not directly attached to the ovary, but they are external to the ovary. There is a space between there. So they're going to go from the ovary and direct connect or attach into the uterus. And again, it's also important to remember that it is inside of these oviducts where fertilization takes place. And so that is where the sperm will meet up with the egg and create that little impending zygote And it's that fertilized egg, that zygote, that will go ahead and attach. And you can see it here. There's the egg entering into the uterus, and here's the egg attaching to the lining of the endometrium. That being the inner lining of the uterus there. And so that's the job. That fallopian tube, those oviducts, carry that egg and connect it into the uterus. When we talk about a ectopic pregnancy, what an ectopic pregnancy is, it's an egg that has been fertilized within the oviduct itself, and the egg does not pass through the oviduct. In fact, the fetus begins to develop inside the oviduct itself, which is extremely painful and typically requires surgery and results in an abortion or a miscarriage, typically, of that fetus. But it needs to be removed, otherwise the mother could possibly experience death. That is something that is a deal breaker. And one of the things that medical science will always do is it will always take into account the welfare and health and care of the mother over the fetus. And so in this case, the fetus would be removed, and the mother's health would be taken into consideration above everything else. And so now this egg that has now been fertilized inside of the oviduct, let's assume, will now go ahead and enter into the uterus, which I have outlined right there in red. And again, there are 3 layers to the uterus. There's the outermost layer, or outermost lining, which is going to be the perimetrium. We then have the muscular middle layer. Let's try that, doing that again. Right there. So that's that tan area, which is referred to as the myometrium. It's the myometrium that is going to, because it's muscle. This here is smooth muscle that you are dealing with. It is not skeletal muscle. That is smooth muscle. And that smooth muscle is under the direct control of hormones, specifically oxytocin. Oxytocin is what leads to myometrial contraction during delivery. And even after delivery, because as we talked about in the lecture, that uterus needs to shrink back down to its normal size, which is about 4 to 6 inches, typically in a younger female. Much smaller as you get older and you hit menopause. And of course, we understand that the expansive nature of the uterus to account for the developing fetus. But that is the muscular area, and again, that is smooth muscle. And then we have the innermost lining, and this is critical for egg attachment. There's that innermost lining right there, what we call the endometrium. And the endometrium has 2 very distinct layers. It has the stratum bacillus, which is going to be the superficial layer of the endometrium, if you would. And then there is also the stratum functionalis. Functionalis because it's the functional layer, if you would. It's the critical layer of the endometrium. It's the stratum functionalis that sloughs off during the menstrual cycle, And so we get rid of that thickened region of the uterus if the egg has not been fertilized. If the egg is fertilized, it's that thickened stratum functionalis that will receive the egg and allow it to attach into the uterus. And again, we'll talk about all of that and how all of that good stuff relates in a little bit. And of course, right below the uterus is the cervix. I'm not going to really spend much time talking about the cervix, but it does play a critical role, especially once pregnancy has happened. It's the cervix that creates the mucus plug that will prevent anything really from entering into the uterus. The body goes into a sealed-off state of heightened security, if you would, and does not allow anything to enter up into that uterus when there is a developing fetus up in there. And that kind of makes sense. Keep in mind, the uterus is connected to the cervix is connected to the vagina is open to the world. And so the uterus could potentially be threatened by any kind of outside bacteria, outside virus, outside infection. And so that mucus plug produced by the cervix is there to ward off, to seal it off, isolate it from the external environment until that baby is ready to be born, until that fetus is ready to be born, at which point in time the mucus plug dissolves, the water breaks, if you would, and from there the baby gets itself into position, tries to lock down into that cervix, and that forces the release of oxytocin. Oxytocin forces the myometrium to contract, and then forces the fetus through the cervical canal into the vagina, and out. Hello, welcome to the world it comes. Now, the vagina, again, not much going on here. It's an opening to the external environment. It's not very long, as you can see. It's only about 4 inches long. It is musculature. And the key thing with this is it is home to multiple types of bacteria. About 18 different bacteria resides in the vaginal area. The reason for the low number of bacterial types is because of low pH. The vagina itself has a low pH, typically anywhere between about a 3 and a 5. So it is acidic. It's an acidic environment. And most bacteria cannot thrive within that range of a pH. Most of your bacteria have a limit of anywhere between about a 6 and a 9 for a tolerable pH range. And even that can vary. But when we talk about broad spectrum bacteria, look at the broad range of bacteria that are out there. Most of them survive in about a 6 to a 9 range. pH of a 3 to 5 is just too acidic. It's going to kill off the bacteria unless you're specialized and you actually thrive in that type of environment, such as lactobacillus. Lactobacillus is a group of bacteria that thrives within the vagina, and it's a bacilli, and so therefore it's rod-shaped. Lacto, because it produces, get ready for this bombshell of a revelation, it produces lactic acid. And so what it does is it thrives off of sugary secretions, high carbohydrate secretions within the vagina. It converts that carbohydrate, it converts that sugar into energy that lactobacillus needs. But as a product of that, it's not doing aerobic respiration. It's not even doing anaerobic respiration. It's doing fermentation. And a byproduct of fermentation is lactic acid. You can basically have two potential end results of fermentation. One end result of fermentation is ethyl alcohol, grain alcohol. And so some bacteria such as Cervaceous, will go ahead and produce ethyl alcohol, grain alcohol. And so they're the type of bacteria that would be used in making your beer, your wine, your grain alcohols, anything that's going to be producing ethanol. The other option for some bacteria is to produce lactic acid as a byproduct. And again, whether you're producing ethanol or lactic acid, you're still going to be lowering the pH. And so here, lactic acid really drops the pH down into a 3 to 5 range. And that kills off a lot of bacteria, or it keeps the bacterial populations down to a level by which they are controlled. Doesn't allow them to flourish. One of those such substances is, drum roll please, Candida albicans, which is not bacterial. In fact, it is a yeast or a mold. It's a fungus. All right? Candida albicans is a fungus. It does live within the vaginal area, but it's kept at bay because yeast and molds do not like high levels of acid. They don't like a low pH. And so it does not become an issue unless, except in cases where lactobacillus levels drop. If lactobacillus levels drop, if they become too low, if you kill off that population, that natural flora of lactobacillus, then what ends up happening is lactobacillus is not breaking down the carbohydrates, which is not producing lactic acid, which is raising the pH. And if you raise the pH into that 6 to 9 range, you guessed it, albicans, Candida albicans, begins to flourish, begins to grow. And you create, within that type of environment, what you're basically producing is a yeast infection. What type of environment would produce this? Well, very simple. When we talk about producing a yeast infection, what is typically happening is the female is on a oh, jeez, I can't believe I screwed that up. Hold on 1 second. Just because that's going to bug me. The female, I'll go ahead and talk while I'm fixing my mess up. The female is typically going to be taking some kind of, I still can't spell it, broad range antibiotic. A broad range antibiotic or a broad spectrum antibiotic is one that is going to not only kill off the infective bacteria, in other words, whatever's causing you to be sick, but it's also going to take out the natural flora as well. It's going to take out the good bacteria with it. In this case, broad-range antibiotics such as tetracycline are going to be attacking, and amoxicillin are going to be attacking lactobacillus. It's going to kill off your lactobacillus levels. When you kill off those lactobacillus levels, you increase pH and you allow Candida albicans to flourish, to grow, to create a yeast infection, which is why many females, when they take an antibiotic, will also eat or increase their intake of yogurt. Because yogurt has typically live cultures within them. One of those is the lactobacillus family. And so you can actually strengthen or bolster help to maintain the natural populations of lactobacillus even though you're killing off everything else, which then prevents, if you would, the yeast infection from becoming an issue. Right? So keep all of this in mind. There's a very specific reason, if you would, why that vagina is going to have that low pH. Right? Now, that low pH, that same low pH, is also going to work at killing off anything that is foreign, including the sperm. Sperm is considered to be a foreign antigen. It's a foreign body that's been introduced into the female. And so it's the female's body as a job is to attack and destroy the sperm that are coming in, which is why the mucus that is added through the Cowper's gland is so critical, because one of the things that that mucus does is it's going to protect the sperm. It's going to help to neutralize some of that pH or buffer some of that pH so that the sperm can go ahead and survive a little bit longer to try to get up into the cervix, up into the uterus, and then enter into the oviducts. And so this here is just a pretty little old picture of what is happening, or as far as everything that we have looked at so far. So again, in case you have not been paying attention, we start here with the ovaries, and then we enter into the oviducts. I spelled oviducts wrong. I can't believe this. I deserve to be tarred and feathered. You have your ovary. We're going to try this again. You have your oviducts. You have your uterus. And then you enter into the cervix. And plug away into the vagina. And so you can kind of see those areas very clearly outlined. Again, here, this outer lining right there would be the perimetrium of the cervix. The myometrium would be located. The myometrium would be this area, all in here. And then the endometrium would be right there. And so you see there's three layers: the perimetrium, myometrium, endometrium of the uterus is also outlined right there. Now, that's female anatomy. All right, and we're not getting into secondary sex characteristics or anything like that. If we had more time, we would get into, once the fetus is born, breast development, milk production, lactation, and all that kind of good stuff. We just don't have that much time right now to do that. But I do at least want to talk about maturing of the egg, because there are some what was I going to say? There are some specifics that you do need to understand, especially when it comes to hormone regulation. And since we are going to talk about ovulation, which is the release of an egg, we might as well understand what happens leading up to that point of ovulation. And so with that, let's look at some basic information here. Keep in mind that during fetal development, each ovary is going to contain about 10 million eggs per ovary during fetal development. 10 million eggs per ovary during fetal development. So you're looking at 20 million eggs overall. By the time that fetus is born, look at what happens to the number of eggs or follicles. The number of follicles drops down to about 2 million per ovary. So during fetal development, we have about 10 million per ovary. At birth, we're down to 2 million per ovary. That's basically 1/5 of what we started out with. By the time the female reaches puberty, you're talking about 200,000 follicles. You started at 2 million at birth. By the time you hit puberty, you're down to 200,000. Of those 200,000 eggs or follicles at puberty, you're only releasing about 400 follicles, or you're only releasing about 400 eggs. 10 million follicles produced to release 400 eggs. Now, a couple things I want to tackle here. First of all, what is the difference between a follicle and an egg? Number one, the follicle carries and matures the egg. When we talk about a follicle, we're talking about the vessel or the capsule by which the egg is going to mature and grow and be released from. That's the follicle. The follicle is what is going to carry and allow for maturity of the egg within. It's the vessel. Which means that the egg is what is potentially and eventually released from the follicle. What is potentially and eventually released from the follicle. That's the egg. So the egg is inside of the follicle. Very often, as anatomists, we get lazy and we interchangeably use the terms follicle and egg. Just understand that. Right? 'Cause I don't want anyone to lose sight of why do we keep going back and forth here. The terms are interchangeable for the most part. I'm going to try to be very intentional about making sure that when I'm talking about the development of an egg, I'm referring to it as the follicle, because that follicle is going to undergo changes to be able to better support the egg and then eventually release the egg. So kind of keep that in mind. Second point I want to make here. Why in the world do we ever want to start out with 10 million eggs if all we're ever going to use are about 400? Why invest that much energy into producing such a high number of eggs if we're only going to need 400? Why not, during fetal development, only produce 600? Or maybe 1,000? Maybe 1,000. You always want to have a few extra. Why 10 million? Some evolutionary biologists think that the high number of egg produced during fetal development and even retained at birth probably links back to our evolutionary roots, where and understand that I'm speaking strictly biological here, but where we are direct descendants, evolutionary descendants, if you would, of an aquatic life at one point in time. There is a lot of evolutionary research out there. There's a lot of evolutionary evidence that suggests before mammals became mammals, not even talking humans here, I'm talking mammals. Before mammals strictly became mammals, that yes, we did have an aquatic life, and that probably we came out of the water and then went back in the water and then came back out of the water again. Hence the reason why we have things like seals and dolphins and things and whales that have maintained their aquatic presence. Because evolutionarily speaking, we started in the water, we came out of the water, we went back in the water, and then we came back out again. Now, with that said, if we have an ancestry of living in the water, then we probably have a direct and linkage to fish. Again, I'm talking as mammals. I'm not talking as humans. I'm talking we are a mammal. And we understand that life here on Earth did start out in the water and evolved in the water, and then eventually came out amphibians, which was the link between the aquatic and the terrestrial life, and then from amphibians, reptiles began to evolve and develop, and then from the reptiles, then we started looking at birds and mammals. What does this have to do with anything dealing with 10 million eggs? Well, anyone that has raised fish, anyone that has done anything with fish, know that fish will lay an exorbitant amount of eggs in hopes that maybe 10, 15, or 20 of these eggs, thousands of eggs that are laid, will eventually reach adulthood. Fish routinely, and aquatic life, octopi will lay up to 10 to 20,000 eggs, and out of those 10 or 20,000 eggs, one or two may actually reach adulthood. And so because of that aquatic evolutionary heritage that we share, and because of the way that the aquatic life has had to create a mechanism by which you can sustain a population by adding one or two each breeding cycle out of thousands of possible eggs that have been laid, we think this is why we've retained that as mammals. We've retained that memory of having to create large number of eggs in hopes that one or two will survive to adulthood. And if you look at the ratios here, 10 million to 400, it kind of fits that. It kind of fits that exact same mentality. You start out with 10 million eggs, hoping that you can get 400 or so that are good that can be released. And so that's the connection. That's where everything's linking in at. All right. So, in the beginning, we have a couple successions, if you would, of follicular development, follicle development, starting up with the primordial follicle, then going to a primary follicle, and leading into a secondary follicle. And by the way, let me not forget this. At the time of birth, there are no new follicles that are produced. At the time of birth, whatever that female has in her ovaries, that is what she has for life. That's what she has to deal with. That's what she has to pull from as far as which eggs are going to be released. Right? So don't forget that as well. So during development, and basically this is all happening pre-puberty. Everything that you see going on right here is happening during fetal development, as far as these follicles being developed. And so you've got your primordial follicle. Right? It's got the egg in it. That's this fancy little term here that you see. Right? An oocyte is simply an egg. Oogenesis is the formation or development or maturity of an egg. All right? And so you have an oocyte that is surrounded by about 15 cells. And so if we drew this out, what would it look like? It would look something like this. And then surrounding it would be about 15 cells. And so you would get a cell here, you'd get a cell there, you'd get a cell here. So, and this is not coming out the way I had hoped, but you get the idea. I think you get the idea. And so you've got these 15 flattened cells, approximately 15 flattened cells that are surrounding the egg. The cells that are surrounding the eggs are what we typically refer to as fecal cells. Fecal cells. So follow the progression of these cells. As a primary follicle, the oocyte, the egg, increases in size. The fecal cells, that are these flattened cells surrounding the oocyte, become cuboidal shaped. And then as a secondary follicle, now we begin to add layers of fecal cells surrounding that oocyte. Here's the other thing to keep in mind. As we progress through, as we move from primordial follicles to primary follicles, not all follicles advance. In other words, only some primordial follicles become primary follicles. Only some primordial follicles become secondary follicles. The ones that do not get reabsorbed. And so there's a selective process that goes on as we advance from a primordial follicle to a primary follicle to a secondary follicle. Not all primordial follicles become primary follicles. Not all primary follicles become secondary follicles. That is extremely important for me to get out there to you. There is a delineation. There is a degradation of the number of cells that are advancing. And then we go into the tertiary follicles. Now, tertiary follicles, there are 3 different stages. It is the third and final phase, though, of egg development. And there is an ant in my coffee. I am not happy. Sorry, easily distracted. That was gross. All right, I'm still going to drink my coffee, though. The end result, the moneymaker here, as far as what is important for a tertiary follicle, is to reach the stage of a Graafian follicle. That's the moneymaker. The Graafian follicle is as advanced as you can get. That's it. That is it. Now, I should mention a couple things. As we will talk about with the menstrual cycle, each month, 20 to 30 secondary follicles will become tertiary follicles. And that's in each ovary. Right? So each month, 20 to 30 secondary follicles begin this transformation into a tertiary follicle. Of that, only one Graafian follicle will be released. In other words, not all 20 or 30 follicles in each ovary reach the level of Graafian folliclehood. Only one will be able to reach that level and ovulate the egg, release the egg. And so you may have 4 or 5 that reach Graafian follicle stage, but only one will release that egg. And we'll talk about what that is. I will give you a hint as to what controls this or what regulates this. It begins with an H, and it ends in a E. You can fill in the rest. If you don't know what it is, I can't help you. All right? But the answer begins with an H and ends with an A. We'll fill it in a little bit later. All right. Oh, look! How amazing is that? It's a word that begins with an H and ends with an E. I wonder if that's the answer to the last question I just asked. It's all about hormones here. All right? Specifically, there are 4 hormones that we need to pay attention to. Right? 2 of them are introduced here today, and they're not even really introduced. We've talked about these guys before. Stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. We understand that follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone are both produced within the anterior pituitary, and that we understand that they are under the direction of gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which is released from the hypothalamus. Very good. All right, well, here's what kind of happens here. Follicle-stimulating hormone, when we look at these when we look at the eggs, all right, I'm throwing a lot at you here because this is a very complex process that's happening all at the same time. When we look at what's happening here, follicle-stimulating hormone is going to directly see that the oocyte is maturing, right? When we look at the tertiary follicle. So when we select the 20 or 30 secondary follicles that are eventually going to become tertiary follicles, FSH is going to direct that maturity of that tertiary follicle. It's FSH that's going to get it to the Graafian phase. Luteinizing hormone is going to act on those thecal cells. There's a lot of development that goes on inside of a developing follicle. In other words, if we were to go inside of a developing tertiary follicle, here's the tertiary follicle. Around the outside, of course, are going to be the thecal cells. All right, that's under the direction of the luteinizing hormones. On the inside is going to be the development of the oocyte. Of course, that's under the direction of, again, follicle-stimulating hormone. And then we've got this area that is in between here and here. This is a term that, and I may not have gone over this in lecture, and that's okay, but this here is what we call the antrum. It's really an area of supportive tissue, nutrient-based tissue that is going to help that oocyte continue to develop overall. And so you've got the follicle overall, that's outlined by the thecal cells. You've got the developing oocyte in the middle, and then you've got the surrounding tissue that is the antrum. You can see this actually really well in histology sides as well. All right, so there are 2 key hormones that are involved in this process. In addition to, of course, the estradiol's, estrogen, and progesterone as well. All right, now it is up through this phase when a fetus is born. Meiosis stops at meiosis 1. Fetus is born. We've arrested development at the secondary oocyte level, secondary follicle level. Meiosis 1 stops. At puberty, meiosis 1 starts back up again, and it does that each month to be able to develop the secondary oocyte into the the secondary follicle into a tertiary follicle. That's all under the direction of meiosis 1. And so you start the process of meiosis 1. At birth, it stops, and you've got this 13-year gap. You've got this 13-year pause in follicular maturity. At the time of puberty, meiosis 1 starts back up again. and allows for the finalization of the production of a tertiary follicle selectively, 20 to 30 follicles per ovary, for which only one Graafian follicle out of those 40 or 60 will be released. All right? Don't lose sight of that. All right. So that's exactly what we've talked about here. All right? This is it. All right? 20 to 30 follicles will be selected to become tertiary follicles. Only one will make it. The rest eventually will end up dying off. All right? Here it is right here. I know, this is exciting stuff. All right? At birth, your primary oocytes, all right, they stop. They're done. They take a rest. 13 years, they're on vacation. Until puberty hits. And then they re-enter into that meiosis 1 to be able to get it up into the tertiary follicle. Now, what determines which Graafian follicle is going to be released? They're not picking up their cell phones and texting one another saying, all right, this month I'm going to go ahead and be released. Let me ovulate, please. And then they don't do a vote and decide which of those 40 to 60 eggs is going to be ovulated. No, instead, here's what happens. It's all based on follicle stimulating hormone. That's what decides it. One Graafian follicle will accumulate more FSH than the others. And the Graafian follicle that accumulates the highest levels of FSH wins. As FSH is accumulating in the one Graafian follicle, it is creating or it's causing the release of estrogen. It's causing that release of estrogen. Estrogen cycles back to the anterior pituitary and tells the anterior pituitary, once estrogen reaches a certain level, stop producing FSH. And at that point in time, the tertiary follicle, the Graafian follicle with the highest amount of FSH, gets to ovulate its egg. Now, mitosis 2 begins at the time of ovulation. Meiosis 2 begins at the time of ovulation. And it's not complete until after fertilization occurs. Right? Keep that in mind. Right? This here is just a pretty little picture that shows you what is happening as far as meiosis goes. The key thing here for you to keep in mind is the process of meiosis produces one good egg and really produces 3 that become polar bodies. They get reabsorbed. Right. Now, this is something that we will touch more on the second WIMBA session. Right? But what happens after this Graafian follicle has released the egg? What happens to the Graafian follicle? And the answer is it turns into what we refer to as a structure known as the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum serves the purpose of releasing estrogen and progesterone, which basically acts as a support system for the uterus, specifically the endometrium. If the egg is fertilized, the corpus luteum hangs around to release estrogen and progesterone. And what it does is it causes extra thickening within the stratum functionalis, that outer layer of the endometrium. Right? The corpus luteum is going to thicken that up. It's going to go ahead and allow that egg to be able to adhere to that wall. If the egg is not fertilized, then the corpus luteum dissolves. And what that does is that's going to drop the levels of estrogen and progesterone down, which is going to allow for the release of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone once again. And so we enter into that menstrual cycle, which is going to be the sloughing off. And at the same time, we're getting the next batch of eggs ready to compete to see which egg is going to be released. And we'll look at that a little bit more in the next WIMBA session. And this here is just a pretty little picture of what the phases of follicular development all looks like. All right. Again, the key structures here for you to really focus in on is going to be there's the tertiary follicle right there. You can see the fecal cells. You can see the developing oocyte, and you can see the antrum, which is located right there. This here is the Graafian follicle releasing the egg, and then these three bad boys over here would be your corpus, your various stages of the corpus luteum. And again, if the egg is not fertilized, the corpus luteum dissolves. If the egg is fertilized, the corpus luteum hangs around to be able to secrete estrogen and progesterone, which basically shuts down luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. And the shift goes from being the shift of the ovaries shift from egg maturity, follicle maturity, to uterine support, because now you've got a fertilized egg and all that energy and resources needs to go in caring for that potential fetus. And on that note, I know this is about an hour or so long, this WIMBA session, but it all kind of fitted together, so I didn't want to split this one up. But with that said, you can get a nice long workout in, and as you are reviewing this material. As always, if you have any questions, make sure you let me know, and I will be happy to answer your questions. And happy studying, and we'll see you around. This is Professor Young, signing off.